Innovation, Building the Future Australia. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Peter Beattie.
Can I firstly thank you for the invitation to be here today, and let me start by making this point. There's no doubt in my mind that 50% of all future economic growth in developed economies is going to come from knowledge. That means innovation is absolutely essential for any superannuation fund or any investment with a long-term strategy. And this is not a partisan view. Let me read you a quote from the New Zealand Prime Minister John Key, and he said this: "It's my view that we need to put science at the heart of this national-led government. If we don't do that, we are simply not going to get the economic gains that New Zealand needs. We won't have the standard of living that we deserve." And it's not a lot more complicated than that. Well, there you go. You've got both sides of politics, and he's absolutely right. What I want to talk today about is Australian, it's either an innovation mind or an innovation economy. And it's not going to be any surprise to you that I support the concept of an innovation economy. If you have a look at the discussion outline, what I want to basically cover is this: is Australia's strong economy sustainable? Can Australia maintain its standard of living when the resources boom subsides? And any of you who've been to the Middle East, and you've been in particular to the United Arab Emirates, will know that they're already planning for a post-oil economy. And any wise investor or any wise government or corporation in this country would be planning for a post-resources economy, no matter how long it takes. Secondly, can Australia grow industries that aren't banking or mining? You'll understand why I refer to those two industries in a minute when I come to the slides. Australia is leading in research outcome. I ask the question, why haven't we been successful in commercialising that innovation? Does government need to be more supportive when it comes to industry creation? There's a case study. It's a new model of innovation commercialisation. It's the Medical Research Commercialisation Fund, which Geraldine indicated I'm a director, and we have the CEO, Chris Nave, who is here today, as well as Denise Allen and Winston Hall, and they will be around for the conference. If you want to ask questions with them after I go, I'm sure they'd be most welcome in taking those questions. And finally, is there a role for the superannuation industry? Significant restructuring in the Australian economy. If you look at the graph, the makeup of the Australian economy has changed quite rapidly. Economic growth has shifted from the traditional states of New South Wales and Victoria to the mining states of Queensland and Western Australia. This is not necessarily a bad thing. You'd expect me to say that coming from Queensland. However, when we look at jobs growth, the picture becomes more concerning. Despite economic value, the mining is not a large employer. Now, it's very important to Queensland and Western Australia in the national economy when it comes to royalties and income, but in terms of employment numbers, it doesn't employ a large number of people. In fact, the mining industry represents about 2% of all jobs in Australia. If you have a look at the breakdown in that graph, that you can see the contribution of the services industry. So, despite the economic contribution that mining makes to the economy, it contributes very little in terms of overall employment. From the early 1960s through to today, the mining industry has contributed less than 2% of all jobs in the economy. And this remains the case despite the now prolonged mining boom. Now, for an industry that's interested in superannuation contributions, the number of employees are obviously vital to your future. Hence my point. It's not been a large employer, notwithstanding the other indications. So let's move on. The erosion of traditional manufacturing base, we know that's happening, but innovation categories are growing strongly. So if you have a look at professional and scientific, look at specialised machinery, you can see where the graph is going. It demonstrates the changes occurring within the manufacturing industry of the past 10 years or so. Whilst the total amount of manufactured goods being exported has changed very little over the past 5 years, the mix of these goods has and continues to change quite dramatically. High technical and manufactured products like those produced in the scientific and specialised machinery sectors, they've grown strongly, as I mentioned earlier, whereas our traditional manufacturing sectors have and continue to contract. Now, pharmaceutical manufacturing, for example, is the second largest export industry and employs over 40,000 people. Now, the other point that's relevant here is it's no longer just manufacturing, but white-collar jobs are being lost to low-cost, low-salary countries as well. And there's some of the headlines or stories that have appeared recently which confirm what I'm saying. A reasonably new and potentially more concerning trend has been the exporting of high-skilled and highly paid Australian jobs to low-cost countries and the so-called white-collar jobs. Now, I guess when we talk about politicians being white-collar employees, quite a lot of you would like to see them exported anyway, but just leaving that aside for a minute, I've used the banking sector to illustrate the problem, but it has been happening for many more years in industries such as telecommunications. These are Australian-owned companies laying off Australian employees to employ people in other countries. Whilst this may have an immediate short-term benefit to a company's bottom line, one can wonder what the long-term effect may be on Australia. This trend means less people paying tax and spending money in Australia. I'm sure that I don't need to point out again to an audience such as yourselves that it also means less employer superannuation contributions as well. So where are the new jobs and industries? Australia cannot continue to compete on cost. If we try to continue to compete on cost, it doesn't take a Rhodes Scholar to work out that our salaries will continue to fall as those in developing economies rise until there's some sort of equilibrium is reached. Unfortunately, equilibrium will be nothing like the wealth and prosperity that we as Australians enjoy today. So Australia needs to identify industries where we have an existing strength, industries that rely on intellectual property protection and constant innovation, supporting high-cost goods, salaries and income. Now, the Cocula and Australia is a good example of this in operation. If you have a look at this story, you'll see in 1974 and 78, thanks to Channel 10 telethons, it funded a prototype and early clinical trial. The government funded the early commercialisation. It listed in 1995 at $2.50 and is now $58.50. The market cap is $3.3 billion. As you can see, 10% revenue growth in 2011 and over 2,000 employees. Now, this really is a great example of what Australia can do, although you'd hope that a telethon isn't required to get our future blockbusters off the ground. I think the graph that was shown earlier when Geraldine was speaking also gave an illustration of quite a number of other innovations that Australia has been world-renowned for. Now, Australia certainly punches above its weight in scientific publications. So we need to try and work out why Australia hasn't been successful at creating a large and prosperous knowledge economy. This table on this slide shows that Australia is number 2 in the world in terms of scientific publications per capita, as that red line indicates. Therefore, it certainly isn't to do with our scientific base, which is very, very good, which on any measure is world class. Now, this next set of indicators will explain why. Innovation input is on the mark, but translation is woeful. This table shows, the one on the left, and I hope you can read it, it shows the 2011 ranking of Australia versus 125 other countries in the highly regarded Global Innovation Index, produced by the prestigious French business school, INSEAD. Australia ranks number 12 in the most recent survey in terms of innovation input, which is a measure of the ecosystem for environment, taking into account such things as political, regulatory and business environment, as well as the human capital, that is the number of skilled people and the infrastructure. We rank 31 in terms of innovation output, which is essentially the scientific and creative production of the country, the new innovations, ideas and products. So for a country of Australia's size, we actually do pretty well. I mean, there's only 22 million of us. That's like the population of Southern California. If you threw in Los Angeles and San Diego, that's our population. There are cities in China who have our population. So we do pretty well. We're actually very smart. However, when you look at the innovation efficiency, which is the ratio of output over input, we plummet to number 96 out of the 125 countries. That means that we are great at coming up with ideas, but terrible at translating them into products. That's our major weakness as a country, and that's our major weakness as an economy, and that should be of concern and of interest to everybody in this room. So why can't Australia commercialise this innovation? Is it insufficient, significant private enterprises in the innovation economies? Does Australia have IT equivalents to Microsoft or Intel or Google? And is Telstra and Optus, are they the opportunities for Australia? Does Australia have the healthcare equivalents of Pfizer, GSK, Johnson & Johnson? And we do have CSL, which is Australia's largest biotech. It was government funded for 75 years before privatisation. Without large Australian corporates to take on the commercialisation of Australian innovation, we will remain the innovation mine for the world. That is, people will steal our ideas and they will get the commercial benefit. The real challenge for us as a nation is to actually do the work here. Now, there's many models to do that, including partnership and sharing, but we have to do more of it in this country. Now, venture capital has a role to play, but the traditional venture capital model hasn't been successful in Australia. And again, as John Brumby would know, because Queensland and Victoria led Australia when it came to the development of the biotechnology industry, one of our major challenges was getting venture capital. And yes, we've attracted some of it here, but it is very difficult, both now and will be difficult ongoing. So, is Australia's current strong economy sustainable? The answer to that, of course, is yes, but we need to look at the very poor support of commercialisation and translation. If you have a look at the graph there, the green one, Australia spends over $8 billion per year on research, as demonstrated by the green bar. If we compare this to the funding that the government provides to support the commercialisation of this research, it tells a pretty dismal story. But the story gets worse. Almost half of this commercialisation funding is given to the automotive industry. And if you have a look, I think you can see the differences between the red and the blue, and if you follow the graph, you'll see what it means. Less than 1.5 or about 1.5% of the amount spent on research is spent on commercialisation once you take out the support for the automotive industry. Now, I'm not being critical of the automotive industry, that's not my agenda here. What I'm trying to point out is if you take it out, just how much is left for commercialisation, and that is at the heart of our problem. It's one of the reasons why those of you who are Queenslanders will know, because we're talking about translational research here, that later this year there will be the Translational Research Institute, or the TRI, will be opened here in Queensland to do exactly that, translate research. It's a huge undertaking, but it will deal with some of those issues. As I said, there is a case study, a new model of innovation commercialisation, and that's the Medical Research Commercialisation Fund, of which I have the honour of being one of the directors. Now, this is a totally different model, and it's one I think that is not only important, otherwise I wouldn't be a director of it, but it is essential for investing in innovation. Now, it's a collaboration between Australian Super and statewide, 4 state governments, Victoria, New South Wales, Western Australia and Queensland, and Australia's leading research institutes and research hospitals. And I'll show a graph of those in a minute, because it doesn't matter where you come from, those institutes are in fact an active part of this new model. It invests exclusively in early stage Australian medical innovation. Early stage because that's the crucial stage of where there needs to be support for the innovation. That's the stage where in many cases the ideas get stolen and taken elsewhere. Now, it's exposure to a large number of medical assets, more than customary, and then enforces a very strong attrition, allocating the majority of the capital to the performers. Now, what I mean is this. In a typical venture, for each fund, it makes about 4 to 5 investments per fund. Now, because it's early investment, again, as you would all know, the risk is high, so it makes sense to have a broad range of investments, increasing the probability of success. So that's how the MRCF invests, it plans to make 20 to 30 investments from a wide range of hundreds of opportunities which come in from the institutes. So you've got the best institutes in Australia putting forward their best ideas, but still there's hundreds of them. So what the MRCF does is then pick the best from them. Now, it goes through quite a ruthless culling process, as you would expect, and it cuts them down to the most likely, and the majority of the funds that are invested go to the survivors. Now, this is a portfolio business, as you know, but it actually fine-tunes it down to the best of the best of the best. And that's how you minimise the risk. That's how you also develop a portfolio business. Now, the MRCF has aggregated, if you like, a virtual Australian pharmaceutical company. The type of model across sectors, capitalising on the research and capability platform, and could contribute to the growth of the sustainable innovation industry in Australia. It is a new model, it's unique, and I think it's worthy of being followed elsewhere. Now, if you have a look, I mentioned the number of institutes. I hope you can read that. I mentioned the states involved, but you can see there, these are the best research institutes in Australia. Now, given the slide I showed earlier, I guess it's little surprise that demand for this type of model has been extremely strong from the medical research sector, with the collaboration now including most of the major medical research institutes and research hospitals across Australia. So, if you have a look at the institutes, they have something like this. In 2010, the 32 MRCF medical research members had an annual revenue of over 2.5 billion, and employed more than 15,715 research and clinical staff. It published more than 5,325 peer review papers and included all of the major Australian medical research institutes and hospitals, as I've said 3 times. I just wanted to make sure everybody got the picture of how smart these people were. By combining the capabilities and outputs of all these members, the MRCF has effectively created a virtual pharma with the same research and clinical capability as the major international pharmaceutical companies. It is effectively harnessing the capability that has been built up over many years of government and philanthropic support, and for the first time is aggregating this capability in a coordinated fashion. Recently, some of you may be aware that it supported a company called Osprey. It's fully underwritten IPO. It'll be on the stock market and the listing will be in May. So you give that, when you see Osprey, you give some idea of that's one of the outcomes of the MRCF model. The MRCF has done 13 investments today. There's Osprey that I mentioned earlier, and you'll see, as I said, the listing in May. Some of you may be aware of those companies involved, but there are 13 investments to date. And the investments in the MRCF collaboration benefit in that they get a first right of review of all the opportunities being developed by the research organisations. We all know that highly technical fields come with highly technical risk, so investing in this space really is a portfolio game, as I mentioned before. The MRCS gets access to a very broad portfolio, and that has the ability to back the winners from a very large pool. Now, because of time, I'm going to need to truncate some of these remarks, but let me come to make some points to you. Is there a role for the superannuation industry in innovation? Now, clearly, I would argue that there is. The superannuation industry is built on Australian superannuation guarantee, soon to be 12%. Without new job creation, can the superannuation industry continue to compete the virtuous circle, sustaining retirees with strong investment returns and continued contribution growth from the workforce? The superannuation set to grow, will there be enough diversity for Australian investors? If you have a look at this, 61% of ASX earnings are generated by 2 industries. You can see what they are. Only 2 industries. In addition to that, 61% of ASX earnings are generated by 10 companies, 4 banks and 2 mining companies, and they account for 49%. So clearly, on any model, there has to be some diversification in terms of investment. So what can be done? As we've said, venture capital has an important role to play, but new models need to be identified that provide appropriate returns and lower fees. Clearly, government needs to do more. Spending around about 1% of the annual R&D budget on translational commercialisation is not enough. In this time of relative prosperity, should Australia establish a pool of capital to invest in the next generation of industries? Super investment returns are taxed at 15%. Could a fraction of a percentage of this be invested in job creation? Could the superannuation industry encourage the government to establish such a fund? It would require the superannuation industry to take a long-term view of sustainability and growth, but also a long-term view about where the world economies are going. What I said at the beginning about what innovation is going to do for the growth in future economic development in all our major companies. So you'll notice that I've not asked anything specifically of the superannuation in these concluding remarks. But my question to you in the audience, however, is this: can the superannuation industry not afford to support the creation of the next generation of economies? And I conclude by saying this: China and India and their economies are changing the world. China is now number 2. It will be number 1 by the end of the 2020s. India will be probably the second economy in another 30 years. They are spending enormous amounts on innovation. They are leading in a number of these areas, even though we haven't realised that in Australia. We have to do the same. That's why the MRCF model is the way forward, and I'd hope the industry would give some thought to what I've said. Thank you.